episode, what is it, 34 of Generation Jihad, Bill? Is that what we're up to now, 34?
We are up to 34, Tom. Hello, everyone.
I'm Tom Joscelyn. I'm here, of course, with Bill Roggio. We are senior fellows at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and we run FDD's Long War Journal, which these days we are backlogged. I've got a lot of stuff to write to get up there. Just haven't been able to get it up there, Bill. We got a ton of articles to write for something. We're in that weird spot where Washington has decided once again that none of this really matters and that the jihad is basically over and don't worry about it. And yet I seem to have a lot of stuff on my list to write about. How about you?
Yeah, Tom, it's difficult to prioritize it. It's sometimes, and it's just difficult mentally to deal with this too. As our listeners know, we like to complain a lot, and this can be our therapy session. And so, yeah, we'll leave it at that. We
got a lot to write about and talk about, though. This week, we're going to do sort of a news recap or recent events recap. Now we're not always basically going to be right on top of the news. If something happens, we're not going to necessarily do it that day, but we'll do it, as quickly as we can. We had a previous episode with Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. That was a very long episode. I think it was a good sort of rundown on different issues and talking about this stuff. This week we're going to talk a little bit about some recent news stories or some things that are happening, principally in the world of Al-Qaeda, I think, right, Bill? I think that's what we'll focus on.
Yeah, definitely Al-Qaeda, Tom. That's been the story for the last several weeks.
So just before, or about a week and a half, I guess, before Thanksgiving, something like that, the New York Times confirmed that the deputy emir of Al-Qaeda, a guy known as Abu Muhammad AlMasri, also known as Abdullah Ahmed Abdullah, longtime Al-Qaeda veteran, somebody who's been wanted by the U.S. government since the 1990s, that he was killed in this basically assassination operation inside Iran, inside a well-to-do suburb of Tehran, by a pair of Israeli assassins riding on a motorcycle. He was also killed alongside his daughter Miriam, who was the widow of Hamza bin Laden. Now, we've been tracking Abu Muhammad or writing about him for a long time. Abu Muhammad AlMasri, which of course means the Egyptian. He's somebody who's well known in counterterrorism circles. He's somebody who's been well known to the U.S. government for decades now, or more than 2 decades. It was obvious that the U.S. was keeping tabs on him inside Iran. You can see by various statements by the State Department and others that sort of, the U.S. and intelligence officials, counterterrorism officials were tracking him there and tracking others who were there. The surprising thing was that he was killed in this targeted assassination, reportedly by the Israelis. This is something that is new and unique when it comes to the story of senior Al-Qaeda in Iran, right, Bill? Now, can you think of anybody throughout all the years that Al-Qaeda has had senior personnel in Iran? Can you think of anybody who's ever been targeted there? I can't.
No, Tom, to me, this is one of the things that really stunned me about this. We've known for 19 years that senior Al-Qaeda leaders, the top level leaders, as mid-level operatives, key commanders, their families, have been sheltering in Iran. And yet in all the 19 years, this is the first. So one time in 19 years that the U.S., or actually it wasn't even the U.S., it was apparently the Israelis.
Israelis acting at the behest of the U.S., reportedly.
At the behest of the U.S., reaching out and targeting an Al-Qaeda leader. And so, everyone, there's a couple of things about this, and I hope I'm not jumping the gun here, but to me, touting this as a victory, to me, it's really, it really makes you think about how active Al-Qaeda's network has been in Iran, that Al-Qaeda's number 2 and one of the most dangerous and most wanted Al-Qaeda leaders was killed there only after 19 years. And yet who else is operating there? Who else?
Yeah, so we're going to get into this about, who this guy was and everything. One of the interesting things about all this is that, I was going to save this for when we do the Iran Al-Qaeda episode, but I guess I'll talk about it a little bit here. You remember, Bill, when we were actively advocating for the release of the bin Laden files for years, from 2011, 2012 to 2017. CIA released most, supposedly all, but most, we think, of the files in 2017. And there was this narrative that was put out by some former Obama officials. One in particular, Ned Price, was very active in doing this. A guy who basically his whole shtick is to pretend he's an intelligence professional and really he's just a partisan hack. One of the story that he put out was that former CIA director Mike Pompeo became Secretary of State. they had orchestrated putting these files out in a couple years ago, basically to justify a war with Iran, and that there's nothing in the files about Al-Qaeda in Iran, and yet these files were going to be used to justify a war with Iran. It was all totally internally inconsistent nonsense, sort of conspiracy mongering. And of course, we didn't advocate before the files came out that this was going to show anything that should lead to war with Iran. When the files came out, we didn't say it should lead to war with Iran. And in the 3+ years since then, we haven't argued that these files are the basis for a casus belli for war with Iran. But, this conspiracy theory sort of took hold in some circles there. The guy pushed it. But the funny thing about all this is here you have, now the whole idea was there's nothing to the Iran Al-Qaeda story. It's just these warmongers making this up, which is all nonsense, folks. But here you have the number 2 of Al-Qaeda, who was, according to the New York Times report, living in Iran for the last 5+ years, operating in Iran and alongside his daughter. And there's some more to that story as well. Everybody, the Times and others were looking at this. Well, this is surprising, the Times reported, because, what is he doing in Iran? Well, holy cow. You really,
Tom, that was the most laughable part of the report, especially given the fact that the New York Times has reported on senior Al-Qaeda leaders living in Iran, and all of a sudden they're surprised by this. It's just laughable.
This story, the Iran Al-Qaeda story, is probably, it's one of those ones that I am actually sick of talking about it, even though I have to talk about it because I've written about it a lot. And part of the reason I'm sick of talking about it is because it's mired in this sort of framework that's just post 2003 Iraq, which is just larded with mythology and really just stupidity and ignorance, where every story that you talk about, anytime you talk about Iran interacting with Al-Qaeda, there's some people like this guy, Ned Price, and others who immediately try and portray it as some sort of active warmongering, which is really idiotic. But here's this guy, Abu Muhammad AlMasri, now is gunned down, well-to-do suburb of Tehran, and nobody disputes that he was there living his life, really, and that he was acting freely. We've reported on him being there. Even there was a Al-Qaeda guy, of course, as I've talked about, Abu Qasim al-Arduni, the Jordanian guy. He was in Syria. He wrote about how Abu Muhammad al-Masri and Saif al-Adil were both, basically living freely, living their lives in Iran, and were weighing in affairs. The UN's reported on that. Obviously, the State Department was aware of it. Obviously, the Israelis and U.S. counterterrorism officials were aware of it. So, I just was looking at this story thinking, who the hell needs the bin Laden files to talk about, senior Iran guys, senior Al-Qaeda members being in Iran when you have active intelligence like this that postdates bin Laden's death by a number of years,
Hey, Tom, and real quick, they use the same. Well, then would Ned Price be arguing that his own Treasury Department was pushing for a war with Iran?
Yeah, it was Obama's Treasury and State Departments. I've made this point. This is why I'm sick of talking about this, because I've just made this point so many times now. It's like, it gives me a headache. From July 2011 to July 2016, it was Obama's Treasury and State Departments that routinely and over again pointed to the senior Al-Qaeda leaders operating in Iran, or Al-Qaeda facilitators operating in Iran under an agreement with the Iranian regime. This wasn't one of these things where, the official position of the U.S. government, State Department, Treasury Department, under President Obama, as the Obama administration was seeking some form of détente in the Iranian nuclear accord with the regime, they're the ones who are making this case over and over again. But yet somehow the conventional wisdom, which you see reflected in the Times reporting on this and other reporting on this, is that somehow these two don't cooperate or can't collude with one another. And it makes me, Bill, I'm sort of fascinated with the epistemology of all this. And of course you have to do with the political layer, which is all,
garbage.
Yeah. We've said enough about that. I think that how we think about the political layer on all this stuff. And the ideological layer that you can see in some of this stuff. And I'm going to take apart some of what Price and others spread around that time in a future episode. I'm definitely going to do that as part of the Iran Al-Qaeda stuff, because I'm going to eviscerate that whole position. But their whole argument, I'm just going to eviscerate it. But talking about this here now with what's going on here, you see this conventional wisdom in the New York Times reporting on this. It's surprising, because they're just bitter enemies, Iran Al-Qaeda, that he would be there. And, it's just surprising to me that people can't process basic facts. The conventional wisdom is that Iran and Al-Qaeda can't possibly cooperate because of their theological or ideological differences. This has been debunked by the sources of conventional wisdom, which are U.S. government assessments, really, over and over again. In other words, there is no real analysis that derived this conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is based on ignorance, And if you go back to the 9/11 Commission report, for example, this bipartisan commission found exactly the opposite, that their differences in ideology and religion did not preclude cooperation. In fact, that they were able to strike bargains going back to the earliest days of al-Qaeda's time in the Sudan. Again, I don't want to give it all away. We're going to talk about this. But Abu Muhammad al-Masri was part of that. This is a guy whose career and at this nexus between Iran and al-Qaeda went all the way back to the early 1990s. And yet here we are sitting here talking about this as if this is, to some people, it was sort of shocking or a surprise. And I just,
Yeah, Tom, and on the warmongering issue, and I know we've said this numerous times, but it just bears repeating. You and I have been very clear. We do not advocate launching a war against Iran. We have very serious questions about our political and military leadership and our performance over, and this is not an indictment on our fighting men and women in theater. It's the political and military leadership itself. They can't win wars. They can't prosecute wars. They can't remain committed to a cause. And when I see what's happened in Iraq and in Afghanistan and Somalia and Libya and other theaters, I can't advocate for the U.S. military to put U.S. troops in harm's way in Iran. We can't win the wars we're currently involved with. We have to pretend we have to end them honorably, end these so-called endless wars.
And that's the mantra nowadays, anyway. I mean, by the same token, I have a lot of misgivings, as we talked about just pulling out entirely, because you're just allowing this jihadis to take over, But the point is that you should be able to talk about senior al-Qaeda figures being in Iran without having to deal with this prism of, you're trying to justify war with Iran, which, I think the people that know us and actually know our work know that's not true. But you have this politicized layer on all this stuff that you have to deal with that we, dealt with a little bit in 2017 when the Bin Laden files were released. And I still am going to take apart that whole nonsense at the time, just in the future episode, because I think it's worth doing for the history books and for people to sort of understand just how dumb a lot of the conversation about this stuff is in Washington in these circles, and it is stupid. That's the bottom line, and ignorant. But so here's Abu Muhammad al-Masri, who's in a well-to-do suburb of Tehran. Apparently in a neighborhood teeming with IRGC. No surprise there, right? We know that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been, very active in exporting the Khomeini revolution, but has also, its interests have converged with al-Qaeda on a number of occasions. There's a whole historical pattern there as well. And, so they also killed his daughter, Miriam. Now, there's some reporting. We haven't confirmed this, but it's in the reporting. I saw some Associated Press and some other various reports that Miriam, his daughter, was actually active within al-Qaeda as well, worked with her late husband, Hamza bin Laden, basically, and helped manage his affairs, and that she may have actually been playing an operational role as well within al-Qaeda at the time of her death. Of course, I have no way of confirming that, no way of getting an inside sort of baseball there within al-Qaeda. This is something that intelligence officials are saying. Wouldn't surprise me, right? But
definitely not, Tom. I mean, they love to have the Bin Laden name out there, and Al-Qaeda has always had an active women's branch. And just real quick, Tom, that neighborhood, my understanding from talking to people in the intelligence community is basically like killing Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, which is basically the West Point of Pakistan. That's the kind of level of security that was there. That just shows how Iran really was sheltering this guy.
But Bill, they can't possibly cooperate, So, but look, this guy too. I mean, when it comes to this guy's career inside Iran, I mean, obviously there's evidence, including from the Bin Laden files, ironically enough, which we've written up, and other pieces of evidence that at times senior al-Qaeda leaders were held in a form of contested sort of detention, and this became a point of conflict between al-Qaeda senior leadership and the Iranians. But, during one of those periods, one of the things that we got the U.S. government to release in 2017 was the wedding video for Hamza bin Laden. And it's Hamza bin Laden getting married to Abu Muhammad al-Masri's daughter, Miriam, inside Iran. And you could see Abu Muhammad al-Masri, the screenshot that I took at the time from the video when we reported this in 2017 at Long War Journal. You can see in the screenshot, I think he's in the screenshot at the top of that piece I wrote, sitting to Hamza's right, the reader's left. We can link to that again so people can see it. That's probably the most recent image of him, because if you look at the wanted post the U.S. government has put out, the other information they put out about him, they're using this dated photo, I think from Egypt, where he's sitting there in like a tie and a dress shirt, all sort of, very, well-groomed, clean-cut, certainly a dated image from the 90s, if not earlier. And this was a much more recent image of him that you can see on Hamza bin Laden's wedding video. And this is a wedding that took place in Iran. And what was interesting about that video was if you look at it, these guys were not under any form of duress during this ceremony. That's for sure. This was sort of a festive occasion. They were celebrating this union of Osama's ideological and biological heir to Muhammad AlMasri's, daughter, offspring. So this was supposed to be sort of basically the equivalent of a royal wedding within Al-Qaeda, and it's taking place inside Iran. Yeah, anything comment on that, Bill, or add to that?
No, Tom, that's exactly, it's funny when you said royal wedding, I said that's exactly, they're cementing the marriages within the great houses of Al-Qaeda. It's absolutely correct. Yeah, and that wedding, it was very clear. I think we're pretty sure that we saw one of, I think it was Abu Bakr al-Masri, which was Osama, Ayman al-Zawahiri's, one of his son-in-laws. I think he may have been at that wedding. There seemed to be some notable faces. Who else was there, Tom? If I recall.
It was Muhammad Islambouli, who's
Muhammad Islambouli. That was the
brother of Khalid Islambouli, the assassin of Anwar Sadat in Egypt in the early 1980s. Now, of course, Iran has celebrated the assassination of Anwar Sadat and praised Khalid Islambouli for decades. So, his brother Muhammad is sort of like royalty himself within Al-Qaeda, and, where's he?
They named a street after him in Tehran.
After Khalid, yeah. And I mean, Muhammad, the last that we saw him via social media accounts and pictures, everything, he was in Turkey. He had made his way to Turkey, which is, I guess, a subject for another episode sometime. But the point is that this wedding video, which certain people like Ned Price dismissed as nothing new, actually had all sorts of new stuff in it. If you knew anything about this or paying attention, including more recent images of Hamza and Abu Muhammad al-Masri and others who, nobody had seen these guys for years. And here's some fresh images of them. And of course, the images of Hamza were used to advertise, the reward poster for him. And when the U.S. designated him as a terrorist, they used that image because it was more recent than anything Al-Qaeda had put out.
Yeah. The other picture, the last picture they had, he was like a boy. I think he was like, looking like 7
because Al-Qaeda
old.
wasn't going to put out any current images of him for security reasons. And of course, then Hamza was killed sometime, we think he was struck down sometime in 2018, 2019. We're not really sure on the timing of that. The White House confirmed his death in September of 2019, but he had passed away sometime before that. It's one of those things where he may have been hit in a drone strike and then sort of lingered. This gets into that whole, is he alive? Is he dead game, Bill,
Yeah, Tom, and from what I gather on that, and this is not confirmed by any means, but yes, so this is that part of the, are they dead? I think we should create a game show with this for Al-Qaeda and Islamic State leaders, but he seems to be gravely wounded in a drone strike somewhere either in 2017, 2018, and then he died months, maybe even a year afterwards, but we can't confirm that. But, it just, Al-Qaeda didn't even announce his death. So there we are.
Yeah, but it's interesting looking back. One of the things that we know about Abu Muhammad al-Masri, in addition to the fact that he was a deputy emir for Al-Qaeda, so reporting to Zawahiri and sort of, we'll say, so-called second in line, I guess, in the chain of command, is that during this infighting that broke out in Syria, one of these figures, one of these sort of ideologues within Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which became the center of controversy in Al-Qaeda circles and between competing jihadis. One of these officials, leaked on his Telegram feed, and we caught this right away, these succession letters that were put out by members of Al-Qaeda Shura Council. And several of these letters were signed by members of Al-Qaeda Shura Council. And it showed that Abu Muhammad al-Masri was in that line of succession. Now, what's interesting about that, when you look at that line of succession, is that basically all the guys identified in that succession line, with the exception of one, Saif al-Adil, who's another Al-Qaeda veteran who goes back to the 1990s, been wanted by the U.S. government since the 1990s, also implicated in the August 7th, 1998 U.S. embassy bombings, which I should have said that right away. Abu Muhammad al-Masri was gunned down on August 7th of this year, according to reporting, which was absolutely meant to be a form of symbolic payback, right? Because this was supposed to be sort of not only to stop current plotting, but also sort of to be a symbolic sort of revenge or avenging the August 7th, 1998 U.S. embassy bombings, which were Al-Qaeda's most devastating attack prior to 9/11. And by the way, if you go to the 9/11 Commission report, you can find out that Iran and Hezbollah gave Al-Qaeda the tactical expertise according to the 9/11 Commission for those attacks. But again, Bill, they can't cooperate,
Absolutely not. And Tom, just one real quick point on the timing of his death. They actually did wait till the anniversary of that attack, the bombing of the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. I'm a big fan. You take the targets of opportunity when you can. So if they actually carried out this attack to kill him, then the intelligence there and the operation that's set up inside of Tehran is really good. Just a quick little observation there. I thought of
that. No, it's got to spook the Iranians that they basically could be this.
Definitely does. There's more.
Yeah.
There's messages within messages in that attack. And not only can we kill a senior Al-Qaeda leader in the place of our choosing, they did it on the time of their choosing. And that's just another layer to the onion that gotta scare the hell out of the Iranians.
Well, and of course there are other assassinations, including this Iranian scientist. We're not going to get into that now. That would take place, which are probably part of this whole picture, obviously. But back to the line of succession. So if you look back at those letters that were leaked by this HTS guy, this guy from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, you can see in the letters that Abu Muhammad al-Masri was in the line of succession, and that all the other guys who are in this chain are dead, with the exception of Saif al-Adil, right? He's the only one who's alive, and he's presumably still in Iran. That's where he's been for a long time. Both Abu Muhammad al-Masri, and Saif al-Adil were released in 2015 from some form of detention inside Iran in exchange for an Iranian diplomat who had been kidnapped by AQAP. Al-Qaeda, forced these guys to be freed. And there were 5 senior Al-Qaeda guys freed at the time, 3 of whom made their way to Syria, where they were all killed. And now Abu Muhammad al-Masri has been killed, and you're left with Saif al-Adil. And if you look at the other guys who are in that line of succession, they've been killed as well. Now, this fueled speculation, Bill, that Al-Qaeda is 1 or 2 leaders away from, if they're killed or if they're dead, the whole thing's going to crumble. And I know we saw some people online, sort of repeating this rumor that Ahmed al-Zawahiri died of either natural causes or COVID or something like that. We've been rooting for COVID in that case, the world's tiniest soldier from the beginning when it comes to Zawahiri. But, we've been rooting for him all along in that one case worldwide. But there's rumor that Zawahiri is dead or died of natural causes. We haven't seen anything confirming that as of this point. Of course, we're not in Zawahiri's living room, so we don't have any up-to-date status reports. But the origins of this rumor aren't from people in his living room either. So, we don't. There's nothing confirming that at this point. The Telegram.
And Tom, I think. Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say,
you're going to say what I would
we
think
follow all
you're
these
gonna
Al-Qaeda
say.
Telegram channels, and they're still. Not that this is dispositive, because it isn't, but they're all still saying, when they're quoting old speeches from Zawahiri, who's sort of been quiet for a while now, which has fueled speculation about him and his status. May Allah preserve him or protect him. I mean, which is usually their way of sort of saying, basically he's still alive. But again, that's not dispositive because, after, Bill, going back to the Mullah Omar thing, when Mullah Omar died sometime in about April 2013, and they covered that up for 2 years, you can never rule out anything, right? I mean, who knows? Because the stuff after that Mullah Omar, they played Weekend at Bernie's with Mullah Omar's corpse, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda did for 2+ years. You never rule anything out. But the point is, we don't see any sort of confirmation at this point or anything firm, really, saying that Zawahiri's dead. I mean, there's been health rumors for him for a long time. Certainly, anything's possible, but I don't see anything confirming that or making me want to report that at this point at all.
No, we haven't. And look, if they are playing Weekend at Zawahiri's and propping him up and pretending,
I guess it'd be more like Weekend at Iman's, right? So
Weekend at Iman's, sure. I just thought the ease kind of matched with Zawahiri.
True, that's true, yeah.
But hey, that's how my mind works. Look, that was a huge problem for the Taliban, and Al Qaeda very likely learned. I mean, it basically fueled the support for the Islamic State in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Initially, yeah, it was they got an initial bump from that, the IMU defections and else from the Taliban in part because of that. But in any event, so
it's certainly possible, but we don't see evidence of that other than someone putting a post out in social media and people jumping on it. And by the way, on this list, it was created in 2005. This is 5 years ago. That was the succession. In 2005.
2015 you're talking about. No,
I'm sorry, 2015.
It was before that. It was actually because I actually took those off of Telegram. And so Waheshi who was on the list in the line of succession, was killed in June of 2015. The letters definitely predated June 2015. Maybe even 2014, 2013. Right. It was definitely it's
even more
longer than 5 years. Yeah, longer than 5 years ago. Yeah. So
I mean, obviously things change. I mean, our succession for military and political leadership has changed dramatically here in 5 years. And again, you and I are very clear that Al Qaeda has problems. The targeting killings cause issues, but there's people in the wings. And then there's people that we don't know of that aren't, household names to everyone. Abu Muhammad AlMasri wasn't a household name. And we were told by,
he was actually one of the more well-known ones, actually.
Oh, sure.
There are guys you and I could point to who are far less known,
Yeah, but how can Miller get away with telling
about
us?
Chris Miller now, the acting secretary.
Chris Miller, yeah, right. He tells us in September that there's only one Al Qaeda leader left. That's Zawahiri, and yet we killed two of them in that time frame, right?
The other one being Hassan Abdul Rauf, who was killed by Afghan forces in Afghanistan. He was the head of Asahab, chief media figure in Al Qaeda. He's been killed as well. So anyway, you put together the string of targeted killings to the Al Qaeda senior leadership, and you have this idea you can see some people are running with that, Al Qaeda is going to crumble. If Zawahiri did succumb to the world's tiniest soldier, or, if one or two more guys and the whole network is going to fall apart, right? Now, a couple thoughts on that. I mean, one, look, anything's always possible, right? I mean, we'll report wherever the evidence takes us, wherever the evidence takes us. The problem I have with this is, first of all, there's sort of the boy who cried wolf phenomenon. We've heard this over and over again now since 2011, that Al Qaeda was decimated on the road to defeat, a shadow of its former self. I mean, there's all these sort of buzz phrases, and look, you can debate the degree to which it threatens the West, and we can manage it abroad and stymie terrorist acts, sure, okay, but this, a lot of times these assessments are not rooted in actual observation; they're sort of rooted in sort of policy desires. And so we've heard this over and over again. Now, of course, in the Aesop fable of the boy who cried wolf, eventually the wolf does come. Eventually the boy says, "Oh, there's a wolf who's coming for your flock," and actually the wolf does come, and it turns out to be true. And so you could point to that when it came to like the Mullah Omar phenomenon. Remember, we heard that he was dead a number of times, and finally actually he was dead, right? So you can never rule out any possibilities. But I find it curious because when I look at this stuff, though, it's not based really on analysis, right? So a lot of these people were saying, well, they're one or two leaders away from the whole thing crumbling. There are a lot of assumptions baked into that, right? There are a lot of assumptions. Like they're making assumptions about Al Qaeda's internal workings or lack of cohesion internally, which I think there's contradictory evidence on that, of course. They're making assumptions about the viability and accessibility of potential leaders to take over for Zawahiri and Abu Muhammad AlMasri and others. You and I are working on a list of guys that we think are in the pecking order, Bill. We're going to come out with that at some point. Working on that. I'm
looking forward to that.
There are a number of guys who, you like, when I see these people saying this, that, well, if Zawahiri's, dead, then the whole thing crumbles. You got to wonder, when I look at that, I'm like, is that the only name these people know? Right? Because it seems to be, right? Because, when you look at some of the other guys who are out there, I mean, not just Saif al-Adil, but it's a whole cadre of veterans that we can point to. So presumably intelligence officials can as well. Now, would they have the ability to keep everything together? Would if Zawahiri were to finally die, let's say, or be dead, and the network, we'd get a test, right? We'd be able to test this theory that they're going to crumble, because we'd see who swore bayat to the new emir or who didn't, right? That's one of those things you'd be able to take a look at. But the thing is that I just remember about all this is that, and I'm just trying to think through the epistemology here of all this, which I don't think people are doing, right? They just sort of run with their sort of preconceived biases, right? There are certain analysts who have been saying for years Al Qaeda is just internally this nothing burger in terms of an organization. They don't really have an organization. They're just sort of this weakling that just is going to be put down any moment here. And sort of they use this framework of this rumor about Zawahiri plus the reports of the actual Abu Muhammad AlMasri and others dying, being killed, to say, look, we're back to that point again where the whole thing's going to crumble. And again, just looking at that, I remember when Zawahiri took over for bin Laden, we heard that Zawahiri, the whole network was going to crumble after bin Laden's death too. That bin Laden's death was sort of this huge blow for Al Qaeda globally, and it just wasn't. I mean, it was a blow, sure, and you could argue that it created it fueled problems with ISIS, and that there's all sorts of effects from it, sure, but it wasn't the end all be all. It wasn't the end of the organization.
Yeah, Tom, we did this in a previous episode. I mean, we did a rundown of where Al Qaeda is today, and I think if you look at it objectively, Al Qaeda in the 9 years since bin Laden's death it's either been a push or a net win. I mean, it launched a new branch. Yes, it has problems in Iraq and Syria. And it's held its stand pat or had made some gains in other theaters.
Well, I think, they probably gone backwards a little bit at Yemen at times and elsewhere.
Yeah, right. And that's the ebb and flow of jihad that we talk about, but they haven't been eliminated in any of its theaters.
The assumption underlying this whole Al-Qaeda crumbles when these guys die, Bill, as you know, is that none of those groups are really Al-Qaeda, right? The idea is, sort of the implicit assumption is that there is no international organization, that there is no sort of internal structure to the group, and that these others are just affiliates that are just sort of loosely connected in some way via ideology, or just sort of flying the banner or using the name, and not really part of an organization. And we dispute that based on a lot of evidence. I mean,
including what Al-Qaeda says about itself. It calls these organizations its theaters of jihad. And it admits it has a general command, and then it has theaters in.
And then members of the general command, which is the senior management, aren't just in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We've gone through this over and over again, that they're in other places,
Tom, I'm going to read from your report on Abu Muhammad AlMasri, and it says the signatories, those who signed, the succession, it said, agreed to move down the chain of command until one of Zawahiri's deputies was appropriately situated to accept his oath. And then but prior to that, you say the oath stipulated that each Al-Qaeda leader must physically be located in the Khorasan, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan, or possibly parts of the surrounding countries, or in one of Al-Qaeda's regional branches. So it wasn't saying it needed to just be in Afghanistan, Pakistan. He had to be in one of Al-Qaeda's theaters, and that's Yemen, and that's or Syria, and that's in Iraq.
And folks, I linked to the originals of those line of succession letters, and you can see that's based on my translations of them and interpretations of them, which I think hold up. But you can see the originals at Long War Journal. I mean, the point is their own internal correspondence it's one of many ways in which they're referring to an international organization. It's not this idea that you just have some senior figures somewhere. It's one of those things. When I used to go on cable news years ago, I kind of, one of my funny lines, and I give myself some credit here. I think my TV performances are sort of a mixed bag, let's just say. But one of my high notes was, I said, the assumption about Al-Qaeda was that they're just a handful of leaders waiting to be droned to death in a cave somewhere, and if we just get them, the whole thing crumbles. I said that years ago on Fox. I think it was Fox News when I used to go on there. Years ago, that was one of the assumptions that was made about Al-Qaeda. And here we are replaying the same assumptions over again. Now, again, at some point, look, I mean, if we get this test and Zawahiri does die or has died or whatever, right, the world's tiniest soldier gets him, we're rooting for COVID in that case. We're going to get a test to see who swears baya or oath of allegiance to the new emir. And that's a sort of a big first test, and there's other tests. But the point is that there's other evidence of internal cohesion of the network as well. I mean, one of the obvious ways to do that, and this is something that some commentators deride, but it has more significance than they want to let on, is you can see it in like how their media operates. You can see that the media houses for Al-Qaeda across the different, what they call branches or theaters, they have consistent branding. They celebrate one another. They have they put the media houses logos next to each other to show unity. I sent you some screenshots, Bill, from one of those Telegram feeds for Al-Qaeda where, that guy was saying, look, everybody talks about Al-Qaeda as if there's like these branches and then there's this central organization. They're two different things, but really it's just all one organization, one group. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't that it's a monolith, that there aren't internal problems and that there aren't problems with each of the branches, and there, not everybody, people aren't automatons. Jihadis aren't automatons. They're not these ideological robots who are answering in lockstep. There's all sorts of issues, and some people are probably more committed to the cause than others. Sure. Okay, fine. But the interesting thing is the default assumption on Al-Qaeda that we're dealing with all these years later in 2020, and it is the default, is that there's no cohesion internally at all. And that's been disproven over and over again. And so now we're being asked, basically, with reports of these senior leaders' deaths, to believe it's true once again.
Yeah, this is why my skepticism, if you listeners can't detect it, is quite high on all of these points. Is he dead? And is Al-Qaeda at the edge of defeat? When I hear an argument for almost 10 years that Al-Qaeda is defeated and disorganized and meaningless and all that, and yet people have to continue making the same argument year after year after year, then maybe the opposite is true. And that's what I strongly suspect here. But then again, I'm willing to accept evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, I'm always willing to update my analysis based on evidence. I don't think some of the folks that are pitching this Al-Qaeda is one or two guys away from crumbling are, though. But, so we talked about this in a previous episode. We're going to talk about it again in a future episode. But part of this comes down to defining Al Qaeda and doing the work of, okay, what does the management committee look like? What does the Shura Council? What is the Shura? Who are the members of the Shura Council? Some of those Shura Council members who signed those letters we've been talking about, they're still alive, as far as we know, right? So they're still in the game.
Tom, Abu Muhammad AlMasri and Saif they've been on Al Qaeda's Shura committee and leading one of its organizations for what, 25, 30 years now? I mean,
yeah,
that's career.
Part of senior management anyway of Al Qaeda. Yeah, I mean,
part of senior management in one form or another, leading a committee or being on the executive shura,
or being in line of succession. But the point is,
exactly,
I mean, how many more of these? I mean, so you have a number of veterans. We can point to some of them. We're going to get into that a little bit. I mean, there's all sorts of guys like Abdul Rahman al-Maghrebi, Hamza al-Ghamdi, I mean, there's guys, I can go on and on. There's other guys like that too that we're going to get into. We know are still out there. Yeah, we're following you guys. If we know some of you jihadis listen to the podcast too. I've had some people tell me I need to talk slower, but I think, the fact that I talk fast makes it more difficult for them to translate some of our stuff into Arabic. So that's probably a good thing too. But in any event, there's a whole bunch of them, and now we don't know what their leadership credentials are, or their skills are like, or how effective they are. I mean, it's tough to assess all this. But the point is that a lot of what we see reported around these deaths of senior Al Qaeda leaders is there's always this assumption that it's just the one name I know, and if he's gone, then the whole thing's gone, right? And I think that's a gross caricature of the whole situation. But let's talk about one other guy who just popped up. We've been waiting for this announcement for a while, and it was no surprise. It was actually the opposite of surprise. It was basically exactly what we expected, and I reported at the times what we expected. Is AQAM finally named its new emir, Abu Ubaidah Yusuf al-Nabi, a longtime member, head of the Council of Notables within the AQAM, which is kind of a cool thing. I think we need a Council of Notables at Longword Journal, actually. Don't you think? That'd be kind of, we should have some.
Yeah, that would be great. We've got to work on that.
I kind of like that idea. Let's have a Council of Notables. But so they have a Council of Notables, and this guy was the head of it for a long time. And we suspected, not just because he was publicly facing and was in all their media and was commenting on matters far abroad, but for a lot of reasons, given his pedigree and sort of his importance in the organization, which could be discerned from a variety of sources, this was the guy we thought would most likely be the new emir. But you never know. There's some internal jockeying maybe, and these are human organizations. There's all sorts of things that could have been going on behind the scenes. But finally, it was more than 5 months after Abdul Malik Jurtel, who was the first emir of AQAM, was killed. It took them a while to announce that Abu Ubaidah Yusuf al-Nabi is now the new emir. And it's sort of curious it took that long. I don't have any insight into why, Bill. I know you don't either, right?
No, we don't. I mean, we suspect that they've not wanted to announce some deaths to give victories, but we don't really know the answer.
Our colleague Caleb Weiss reminded me, though, that the AQAM did fairly quickly concede that Jurtel was killed. It's just they didn't announce his successor, which is what's sort of a weird thing. And now, Al Qaeda has, there's a mourning period when the emir is killed of any one of these branches usually, and it takes some time for them to announce a successor. But this went beyond the mourning period, and I'm not sure why. It's an interesting question. One of the things here about AQAM, this is a good example of, this is an organization that we heard for a long time ago wasn't really Al Qaeda. Remember, this was the whole idea that it was just, they took the Al Qaeda name for branding, but they weren't really part of Al Qaeda. And of course, you can disprove that based on a lot of different sources as well. One of the things we've heard but haven't confirmed is that Al Qaeda actually has now this cross-regional Shura Council, which involves members of the different branches who are sort of on one body. Some have referred to it as the Ummah Shura. I'm still working to confirm that, and I'm curious if who within AQAM, if not al-Nabi, then somebody else is on it, and we're working on that story, try and confirm it, or basically show that it's not true. Either way, we're trying to figure out what the deal is there. But there are good reasons to suspect that this is all part of the international organization of Al Qaeda. I revisited in writing up al-Nabi's appointment. I revisited what the French said about Jurtel, that he was the third deputy to Zawahiri and part of Al Qaeda's management committee. Of course, the U.S. government in its infinite wisdom has not confirmed any of that or actually explained if that's true or not. But it gets back to the whole defining Al Qaeda thing, right, Bill? That we
Tom, you're reading my mind on this.
Still don't have there's still not any common definition of this thing. Certainly not in analytic circles, which brings all sorts of stuff out. But even, the U.S. government hasn't put out any sort of clear-eyed assessment of this stuff in years.
Yeah. And, and Tom, I just keep going back to, okay, so why didn't they name Anabi, right? There could be other reasons. It could be maybe it was security. Maybe they didn't want to identify the next emir. But look, the reality is the French know, just as you and you and Caleb, I got to give you credit. I think when we did when Caleb was on that previous episode, you guys basically were very adamant that he was very likely successor.
I mean, the day that Jordell's death was reported, it was the first.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just because he's the only name we know, by the way.
No, it's not.
There are other AQIM guys that were possibilities too, But just in terms of his pedigree and his dossier, it made the most sense, that
it definitely did. And I always go back to that was a very good.
It's like Khalid Batarshi. Remember on AQAP, there was speculation about who was going to be the successor there. We picked him out as the guy who was most likely going to be the new AQAP emir, and he was. Again, there were other possibilities there. There were four chief guys who could have been the new emir of AQAP. But let's talk about this for a second now, because now you have, again, I know we're revisiting or retreading old ground here, but you have Abu Muhammad al-Masri, second deputy of Al-Qaeda or deputy emir of Al-Qaeda, killed in August of this year. You had September of last year, Asim Omar, the head of AQIS, killed. In January of this year, you had Qassem al-Raimi killed in AQAP's emir, replaced. And then in early June, you had Abdul Malik Jordell killed. You had a series of guys in Syria killed. So, look, you can point to this series of guys who were killed, who were senior Al-Qaeda leaders, and it absolutely has to have an effect on the organization in one way or another. But the question always comes down to how many more of these guys are there? And that's what we just keep asking the same question, and nobody really has a good answer, right?
Yeah, and Anabi is certainly a capable step in. I mean, as we've mentioned numerous times, Jordell was the head of AQIM when it was founded, and even
2006
to
to 2007, depending on which date you want to pick, it's really 2006. But so 14 years. He's the head of AQIM. Before that, he was head of GSPC. It's a predecessor organization. Anabi's has a career that stretches back to the 1990s himself. They're still going through the first generation, right, of jihadis,
right.
And
that's really what it boils down to, Tom.
They're going through the first generation.
We're watching the end of the first generation at the end of the first generation.
Well, now this other assumption that you can see implicit in some of like this whole Al-Qaeda is going to crumble any day now sort of narrative is that there isn't a second generation or a new generation. Even though in bin Laden's files, he specifically discusses raising a new generation to replace the fallen comrades. And again, we can name a bunch of guys who are in that bucket from that new generation. And what are they doing? What are their roles in all this? And how are they planning to lead the organization or not, going forward? Again, these are all just getting to the questions, the epistemology of it all, that sort of these questions that are not asked, let alone answered so often in our field, right?
Yeah, Tom, I go back to that file we constantly talk about where I think there was around 15 or 17 up and coming Al-Qaeda leaders. Some of them we killed. Some of them we know are still alive. Like Yassine
That's the one Yassine al-Suri is the leader of it on the first profile in it, right? By the way, in Iran, right? So,
right. He's right.
These are all facilitators,
and
and they've got these very funny sort of commentaries on the different guys. Like one of the guys was portly, and sort of out of shape physically, and the other guys are hotheads. It's just funny internal commentary. This is stuff that was found in bin Laden's compound, personnel files, summaries of some of the up and coming facilitators, and sort of judging whether or not they're suitable for future leadership positions.
And a couple of these guys, we don't even know who they are, and we don't know what their status is. And this is the unknown unknowns, right? That we don't even know what's out there. And then,
those are the guys that were the silent commanders they used to call them, right? Or something like that.
Exactly.
That was what they used to call. That's one of the terms we found out about years ago for Al-Qaeda is they have these guys who are the sort of silent warriors or silent commanders who, they don't advertise their role and stuff. And because they don't advertise their role and what they're doing, the assumption in the West or a lot of American counterterrorism circles is they don't exist, which is not the case, right?
And yet they were important enough to get up to the highest levels of Al-Qaeda's leadership. I believe Atiyah Abdul-Rahman was addressed in that memo, if I recall, or he may have written it up.
Atiyah Abdul-Rahman, one of the things that was this was on one of the other myths about all this was that bin Laden was inactive. Again, where I'm giving away some of the stuff that we're going to do in a future episode, but this myth that bin Laden was inactive and just sitting around watching Al Jazeera at the time of his death wasn't true. I mean, he was receiving these, what we've termed the management papers from Atiyah Abdul-Rahman. Now, here's an interesting question for you folks. If you're out there in Intel world thinking about this stuff, so the bin Laden files, you can read Mike Morell's book, The Great War. You can read various other sources are reporting other stuff. There's other reporting out there that gets us right, that shows that the bin Laden files conclusively disprove the idea that bin Laden was out of the game, that he was actually an active manager or even micromanager with al-Qaeda's global network. And then he had a staff, including Ati Abdel-Rahman, who was sort of his point man for the outer world. It was sort of siphoning or funneling messages from his lieutenants in various places, various theaters, back to the mothership, back to bin Laden. You can see in those same files Zawahiri's running his own management circle, And the question is, who's playing that role of Ati Abdel-Rahman today for Ayman al-Zawahiri? We have some guesses, and we're going to get into that in the future. But the point is that this is one of these things about all this that you see these assumptions made about al-Qaeda, where they're about who's who and who's in the game and who isn't. And there's always evidence that people just aren't aware of, I guess, that basically there are other figures still out there, and you can identify them. And that doesn't get into the guys who don't know.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. Absolutely. I'm looking forward to that episode. It's going to be fun.
All right. So I guess we should probably conclude here briefly on a Afghanistan roundup. We did a previous episode, What Will Joe Biden do? He's sort of been left with no good options really on Afghanistan. And you can see the Taliban, there's some recent, this Taliban has unleashed all sorts of suicide bombers since this phony February 29th peace deal that they signed with the U.S., which of course was a withdrawal deal all along for the U.S. There's been some recent high-profile attacks in Afghanistan by suicide bombers. I think we're still working to confirm who did those. We haven't seen any claims of responsibility on a lot of those, right, Bill?
That's correct.
We're still looking at those. But, basically the war is raging on, and Afghan forces are taking casualties, of course. You have anything to add on Afghanistan? I guess, looking at all this, I'm just struck by, I don't think a lot of the reporting is really sort of processed that the decision-making that has to be made within the Biden team now on this stuff.
Yeah, he's certainly in a hole here. Trump is definitely leaving him with a mess in Afghanistan. He's going to be put in a position, if he wants to leave, as we mentioned last week.
A couple weeks ago now, yeah.
A couple of weeks. Wow, time. If he needs to, or if he wants, he's either going to have to discount the deal. He's going to have to denounce it or pull out of it, however you want to put it, if he wants to keep some troops, because the Taliban isn't going.
So the U.S. is going to be down to about 2,500
January,
troops,
right?
So the question is, if he wants to keep that presence, which is a small presence, beyond April or May of 2021, he's going to have to nullify the agreement with the Taliban, which was a charade anyway, it's a fiasco anyway. There's nothing. The agreement is not worth the paper it's printed on. So. The Taliban hasn't done anything, and the counterterrorism
it showed up. Right. That's all it's done. It showed up at the talks.
We've wiped the floor with its counterterrorism insurance.
Used it to
We've wiped the floor with its counterterrorism insurance. Previously, we're not going to do that again. So, basically, if he wants to do that, if he doesn't want to do that, and he just wants to withdraw completely, then of course you risk very early on in the administration. Kabul being sacked, or a massive, again, crisis in Afghanistan, which is in crisis mode anyway. Which is possible. And the other option would be to increase troops, which you and I don't see as politically viable at all, and just not going to happen. He's not going to send, we don't think so anyway. We don't think Biden's going to want to send more troops to Afghanistan. So you got three options. One, stays with the current 2,500 or so as of his inauguration day, in which case he has to nullify the worthless agreement with the Taliban, the submissive agreement with the Taliban, submissive on the American part. Two, he'd have to full withdrawal, which either consistent with the agreement, so-called agreement, or just in general anyway, or which is possible. Or three, increase troops, which we don't think is going to happen for political and other reasons. So, that's basically, none of those are great options. That's the point. None of those are good options at all.
Yeah, and while this is happening, the Taliban has just stepped up attacks. Yesterday in Ghazni, they hit a base with a suicide attack that was housing commandos. 30 Afghan soldiers were killed. It's unclear if they were commandos. The commandos are basically the best trained force in Afghanistan that is used to conduct the raids against the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. But they're also put in this role of being basically a quick reaction force, which they're not very well suited given their training. So when they get stuck on a base, it's not the best for them. So the Taliban target them at every opportunity. It's not the first time if indeed it was 30 commandos killed or some number, it's not the first time. We've documented numerous attacks like this by the Taliban, suicide attacks. And this happened in Ghazni City, and then suicide attack in the capital of Kalat that targeted the head of the provincial council there. They've killed a brigade brigade commander in Baghlan. They've killed a district leader in Baghdis. And district governor. The Taliban is on the offensive. They've said they would they're doing exactly what they said they would do. And this is going to put a lot of pressure on an upcoming Biden administration. As Tom laid out the options very succinctly, that's really what's in store. I don't see a good ending, for the people of Afghanistan. I think the Taliban I think they're holding back right now too. I think if they wanted to, they could take one or two provincial capitals. I'm not going to say where, but places in the South. It would be very difficult, particularly when the U.S. draws down the 2,500 troops for the U.S. to provide any support.
Well, I think that's a cheery note to end this week's abbreviated episode on. What do you think, Bill? It's again, I always warn you folks, this is not the place to come for happy talk in the middle of a pandemic or otherwise,
I will say, Tom, we'll end this on a happy note. And you laid this out earlier. It has been a good year at killing senior Al-Qaeda leaders. I guess our only objection is not enough and not quick enough. But you got some good names to cross off the list. So maybe we'll get a couple more, but that seems to be they're small victories. Probably the only victories we could hope for in the next year to come. Yeah, and
again, the U.S. has prevented another 9/11 style attack all these years, which is a big deal. They've also failed on their own accord, and that's a whole other episode. If you actually think that through, by the way, and why that is the case, it's actually a lot more complicated, I think, than people realize. But it's an interesting story in and of itself. So we'll have to come back to that at some point. But we will leave it there with our little Afghan roundup at the end of this episode. We're going to have more to say on that in the future episodes, of course, because we just can't get away from it, right, Bill? We keep always going.
Every time I try to get out, they drag me back in.
All right, so thank you for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your podcasts, and we will see you again next week.